close your eyes. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. For tonight, you will travel somewhere far beyond time. Back to the beginning, before the first sunrise, before there were names for light or darkness. In the beginning, there was nothing. No sound, no wind, no ocean, no thought. Only chaos. A vast, endless silence. A space so still it seemed asleep. Yet within that silence, something began to stir. A quiet pulse. A soft rhythm, like the first heartbeat of the universe. Out of chaos came Gaia, the earth. She awoke slowly, stretching across the void, shaping hills and valleys with her breath. Beneath her, she felt the emptiness sigh, and so she created Uranus, the sky, to cover her, to watch over her endless body. When earth and sky touched, the world began to live. The union of Gaia and Uranus gave birth to mountains, oceans, and the first divine beings, the Titans. These Titans were immense, radiant forms of power and peace. They shaped rivers, sculpted storms, and whispered to the stars. For a while, the world knew harmony, but harmony never lasts. Uranus, proud and vast, feared the strength of his own children. One by one, he locked them away deep within Gaia's heart, the dark cavern called Tartarus. The pain was unbearable. Gaia groaned, her cries echoing through creation. She loved her children, and in her sorrow, she forged a plan for revenge. Among her children was Cronus, clever and patient. Gaia placed into his hands a blade of purest stone, and when Uranus descended to embrace her once more, Cronus struck. The sky split apart, the stars scattered. From the blood of Uranus, new beings were born. The Furies, the giants, and from the sea foam that kissed the shore, Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Thus began the age of the Titans. Cronus, now ruler of heaven and earth, brought a strange calm to the world. Time flowed under his watch, slow, heavy, golden. He married his sister, Rhea, and together they gave birth to the next generation of gods. But like his father before him, Cronus was haunted by fear. It was said that one day, one of his children would overthrow him. And so, as each child was born, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, Cronus swallowed them whole, hiding them within the endless night of his body. Rhea wept, her heart breaking with every child lost. But when her youngest was born, a small, glowing boy named Zeus, she could bear it no longer. She hid the newborn on the island of Crete, deep in a cave wrapped in golden mist. Nymphs sang to the child, and the mountain spirits beat their shields to drown out his cries so Cronus would never hear him. The boy grew strong, fed by honey and the milk of a sacred goat named Amalthea. And when he became a man, Zeus returned to face his father. With a storm in his eyes, he forced Cronus to release his swallowed children. One by one, they emerged, reborn, gods of fire and harvest, sea and sky, love and death. The war that followed shook the heavens. The Titans fought to keep their rule, their roars echoing like thunder across mountains. But Zeus and his siblings, the Olympians, fought with lightning, wisdom, and fury. For 10 years, the sky burned, seas boiled, mountains cracked open. The world teetered on the edge of ruin. And then, silence. The Titans fell. Their thrones crumbled to dust. Cronus was cast into Tartarus, bound in shadow. And from the stillness, Zeus rose. He looked out over a battered world and lifted his hand. The storm calmed. The sky cleared. For the first time, sunlight touched every corner of the earth. From that light, new life began to bloom. Trees, birds, rivers, laughter. Mount Olympus rose high above the clouds, crowned in snow and gold. There, the new gods made their home. Zeus ruled the heavens, Poseidon the seas, and Hades the underworld. Hera, proud and radiant, became queen beside Zeus. Athena, goddess of wisdom, was born from his thoughts. Apollo and Artemis, twins of light and moon, filled the nights with song. Aphrodite, born of the sea, made love itself a force divine. And so the world found its rhythm again. The winds carried whispers of divinity. The trees hummed in the language of gods. And humans, small, fragile, curious, began to look up at the sky and wonder who they truly were. They told stories to make sense of it all, of how the world came from chaos, how gods walked among them, and how every spark of beauty or terror carried a piece of Olympus. And perhaps that's why these tales still live. Because somewhere deep inside us, beneath the noise and haste of life, a quiet memory lingers. The memory of a world where every breath, every wave, every heartbeat was divine. Rest now. The night is long, and our journey through the ages has just begun. Close your eyes and let the myths whisper once more. The earth was quiet after the wars of the gods. Mountains stood still beneath the silver breath of dawn. Rivers wound through the valleys, shimmering under the gaze of Apollo's rising light. The seas hummed low and steady, as if the world itself were sighing in relief after the storm of creation. But something was missing. The forests were full of sound. Birds, insects, leaves whispering in the wind. Yet the earth felt lonely. Gaia could feel it. Though her body teemed with life, she longed for a being who could look up, wonder, and speak her name with gratitude. And so, one evening, she called to the heavens. "My children," she said to the gods of Olympus, "you have shaped storms and stars, oceans and fire, but the world is empty without thought. Let there be a creature who can love and question, who can build, destroy, and dream." Zeus, high upon his golden throne, listened in silence. He turned to the elder titan chained in the shadows of time, Prometheus, whose name meant forethought. Prometheus had once fought beside the gods in the great war against the titans. Though not truly one of the Olympians, his wisdom was unmatched. He could see farther than most, not with the eyes but with the heart. "You will shape this creature," said Zeus. "Let it walk the earth. But remember, it must know its place." Prometheus nodded and descended from Olympus. On the banks of a quiet river, beneath the hum of twilight, he gathered clay from the earth and water from the stream. He mixed them slowly, humming an ancient tune that only the oldest mountains remembered. From the clay he formed the first man and the first woman. Their faces were gentle and uncertain. He molded their limbs, their hearts, their eyes. But when he looked into those eyes, he saw only stillness, the soft emptiness of statues. He sighed. "They cannot live without the spark," he whispered. That spark, the sacred fire of the gods, burned only in Olympus. It was the breath of life, the source of warmth, light, and knowledge. Zeus had forbidden it to touch the earth. But Prometheus could not bear to see his creations cold and lifeless. He climbed the long road back to the heavens. For days he walked through storms, through clouds thick as marble. When he reached the sacred halls, he found the divine fire burning within the forge of Hephaestus, the god of craft. His glow danced like liquid gold. Prometheus hesitated, not out of fear for himself, but out of reverence. To steal the flame was to defy Zeus, yet to leave humanity in darkness felt crueler still. "Light," he whispered to the flame, "not for power, for warmth, for hope." He took a hollow reed, hid a spark inside, and carried it down from the sky. As he stepped back onto the earth, the wind wrapped around him like a cloak, carrying the scent of pine and rain. At the edge of the world, he knelt beside the clay figures. "Wake," he said. "The world is waiting." He breathed out, and the spark leapt from his hands into their hearts. For the first time, a human drew breath. The man opened his eyes to the light of dawn and gasped. The woman reached out and touched the soil, soft, warm, alive. They looked at each other, and something wordless passed between them. Wonder. Prometheus smiled. "You are children of the earth and the sky," he told them. "You will build homes, weave songs, tell stories, and remember." He taught them to speak, to plant seeds, to shape tools from stone. He showed them how to read the stars and listen to the wind. Night after night, the humans sat by the fire, the golden glow flickering in their eyes. They laughed, they sang, they dreamed. For the first time, the gods looked down from Olympus and saw something new, creatures who loved, who built, who thought. Some were pleased, others were not. Hera whispered, "They are beautiful." Poseidon grumbled, "They are fragile." But Zeus watched with eyes like lightning. His voice was quiet, yet filled with warning. They have fire, he said, and fire is power. Power always hungers. The other gods fell silent. Below, on the earth, Prometheus continued to walk among his creations. He watched them grow, stronger, wiser, gentler. He loved them as a father loves his children. But deep in his heart, he knew Zeus's gaze would one day fall upon him. The days passed into seasons, the seasons into years. Humanity learned to shape their own destiny. They built villages, learned to write upon stone, painted the walls of caves with dreams. The world glowed softly in the light of their fires. But every flame, no matter how small, casts a shadow. And in the shadow of Olympus, that first spark of rebellion began to flicker, the quiet defiance of a god who had loved mankind too much. The storm was coming. Yet for now, the night remained peaceful. The fire crackled. The humans slept. Prometheus watched the stars, and for a moment the world felt whole. The fires of humankind grew brighter with each passing year. Across valleys and mountains, small flames danced in the dark. Villages glowed like constellations scattered upon the earth. At night, their songs rose softly, laughter echoing under the silver gaze of the moon. Yet far above, the gods watched. The warmth that had brought life now stirred unease among them. They build too quickly, murmured Poseidon, his trident glinting beneath the waves. They no longer fear the dark, whispered Hades from the underworld. They dream, said Athena quietly. They will become what they imagine. Zeus sat upon his throne of thunderclouds, silent, eyes like burning storms. The world beneath him flickered with human fire, thousands of golden embers glowing against the night. Prometheus, he said at last, his voice a low rumble that trembled through the heavens. He has done this. The other gods fell silent. Zeus rose, his robe of lightning trailing across the sky. He looked out toward the distant horizon, where Olympus touched the edge of eternity. No flame, he said, was ever meant for mortal hands. And so he summoned his messengers, the winds, the clouds, the eagles of the high air. Find him, Zeus commanded. Bring him to me. Prometheus stood upon a mountain peak when they found him. The world stretched endlessly below, rivers winding like silver threads, forests breathing in mist. He did not hide. He knew the time had come. The messengers of Zeus approached, their wings cutting through the thin air, their eyes cold with duty. Prometheus, one called, Zeus commands your presence. Prometheus turned slowly. The wind caught his cloak, the scent of earth and ash rising with it. I will go, he said softly. In the halls of Olympus, thunder rolled like a heartbeat. The gods gathered, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Hermes, and the rest, silent as the mountain stone. In the center stood Zeus, radiant and terrible, his gaze unblinking. You defied me, said Zeus. I gave them life, said Prometheus. And what is life without warmth? Without thought? They were not meant to think, Zeus thundered. They were meant to obey. Prometheus raised his head. They will still worship you, Father of the sky. But they will do so with hearts that understand, not mouths that fear. A silence fell, deep, long, heavy as rain clouds before the storm. Then Zeus spoke again, his voice low and final. For your theft you will know no rest. For your compassion you will know no peace. Hephaestus, god of the forge, stepped forward, not in anger, but in sorrow. Must it be so? He asked. It must, said Zeus. And so the punishment began. Prometheus was taken to the edge of the world, a lonely peak where the wind never ceased, where clouds gathered like ghosts around the cliffs. There, Hephaestus forged chains of unbreakable bronze. His hammer fell again and again, echoing through the hollows of the mountain. When the work was done, the chains glowed faintly, alive with divine power. Prometheus stepped forward without struggle. He looked out upon the horizon, the curve of the earth, the shimmer of sunlight upon distant seas. Even now, he said quietly, they build fires below. Yes, Hephaestus murmured, and they will remember you. With tears hidden behind the smoke of the forge, Hephaestus fastened the chains around Prometheus's wrists and ankles, binding him to the stone. When the hammer struck the final link, lightning flashed across the sky. The mountain roared, and the heavens wept rain. From that day forward, each dawn brought the same cruel ritual. An eagle, vast as a storm, descended from the clouds. The servant of Zeus, its wings wide as sails, its cry sharp enough to break the silence of eternity. It tore at the flesh of Prometheus, devouring his immortal liver. He did not scream. He only closed his eyes and listened to the wind. Each night his body healed. Each morning the eagle returned. The days bled into centuries. The centuries folded into myth. Below, humanity thrived, unaware of the god who suffered for their fire. They forged iron, built temples, wrote poetry to the stars. They told stories of Prometheus, not knowing that somewhere, on a mountain wrapped in clouds, he still heard their voices carried by the wind. Sometimes, on still nights, shepherds would swear they heard him. A faint whisper among the stones, a sigh beneath the sound of thunder. Keep the fire, it seemed to say. Use it well. The gods above did not speak of him anymore. But in the quiet heart of Zeus, something uneasy remained. Not guilt, but memory. He would often gaze down upon the mortal world and see the small flicker of a hearth fire, the laughter of families, the glow of light in windows. The flame endures, he would murmur. Hera would rest her hand upon his arm. It is what he wanted. It is what he stole, Zeus would answer. Yet his voice held no rage now, only distance. Time moved on. Empires rose and fell like tides. The gods watched from afar, their voices fading slowly into the rhythm of the world. But the story of Prometheus lingered, a tale whispered beside campfires, retold beneath starry skies. And every flame that burned, no matter how small, carried a trace of that first divine spark. The spark of rebellion, the spark of love, the spark of life itself. After Prometheus was bound and the fires of men burned on the H, the gods watched the earth in their quiet ways. They saw cities rise, saw harvests swell, heard the songs that grew bolder with each passing season. But Zeus, with eyes that could split night, felt the balance shift. Fire had given men power. Power gave them longing. Longing invited pride. So the king of the gods conceived a plan, not of simple vengeance, but of a lesson folded into beauty. He would give the world a gift, and within that gift a test. He called to Hephaestus, who worked his forges beneath the belly of the earth. The god of craft took Zeus's words and shaped them with hands that knew creation. He formed a woman from earth and water, clay warmed with a breath of divinity, fine as porcelain and soft as newly carved marble. Aphrodite anointed her with grace. Hermes taught her speech and wit. Athena clothed her with quiet skill, and the muses blessed her with a voice that could make stone remember its own stories. Each god gave what they had: beauty, charm, cunning, knowledge. And when the work was done, she moved as if life had always lived within her. Zeus named her Pandora, all gifted. She walked like morning, and when she smiled, river songs answered. He presented her to Prometheus's brother, Epimetheus, whose name meant afterthought. He was gentle and slow. He took gifts without thinking of the future. Pandora came to the mortal camp like a bright, strange weather. She learned quickly, laughing as children taught her to spin, listening as elders told the secrets of soil and sky. The people welcomed her warmth the way dry land welcomes rain. But in her hands, Zeus placed not only beauty but a small jar, a vessel bound with a ribbon of cloud, sealed with a promise of mystery. Keep it closed, Zeus said softly to Epimetheus, his voice lowering like distant thunder. Do not peer inside. Some things are not yet for your kind. The jar was finely made, more delicate than anything the mortals had seen. It shimmered faintly, as if a memory slept within. Pandora stood beside it each night and wondered. She would hold it to the firelight and see fleeting shadows moving within, like tiny things pacing in the dark. Curiosity is an old thing. It lived in the hearts of men and gods alike. For Pandora, newly fashioned, curiosity felt like the first stirring of wind under a sail. It urged her slowly, patiently, toward the bound ribbon. One evening, While the moon leaned low and a hush wrapped the village, Pandora untied the ribbon. Her fingers trembled in the quiet. She had been taught to be gentle. She had been given songs and wisdom. Yet the seal opened like a small sigh, and the lid lifted. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with the softest of exhalations, something slipped out. A breath at first, a drifting mote, then another and another, until the air around the jar shimmered and spilled forth a handful of things. Sorrow like a slow rain, fever, toil, envy, grief that clung to the bones like winter. They rose and scattered over the earth, settling into the corners of houses, into the hearts of men, into the ways of days. People woke in the night with new fears. Harvests faltered in far valleys. Lovers argued by hearths where once there was only laughter. The world had changed, not all at once, but as if a new fog had settled into the fields. Pandora dropped the jar and stepped back, small as a child before an unkind weather. She covered her mouth as tears welled, not from the sight of the mischief, but from the knowledge that she had let something loose she had not intended. Her breath hung in the cold air like a pale bird. But then, as her fingers fumbled, the jar gave one last small sound, softer than a bell, nearer than a thought. Pandora peered inside. There, at the very bottom where a faint light clung, was a single thing that did not rush out with the rest. It sat folded like a pale cloth, small and stubborn. Pandora reached in, and when she touched it, it did not bite or sting. It simply warmed her palm. It was the last thing to leave the jar, hope. She drew it out and held it close, and in that holding the world was not empty. Somewhere in distant fields, a man put a seed back into the soil. Somewhere else, a mother hummed over her child, and the tune bent sorrow into something gentler. Hope pulsed like a quiet ember, not a promise that pain would vanish, but a soft companion to carry a heart through. The mortals learned what it meant to live with both shadow and light. They learned to tend wounds and plant again. They sang new songs, songs woven with sadness and a new kind of courage. In the quiet hours, they told the story of the jar and the woman who had opened it, and the tale became a gentling thing, a warning and a comfort braided together. Pandora grew old as mortals do. She loved people with a complicated tenderness, forever carrying the weight of what she had done and the small grace of what she had kept. She walked beside fields where children played, and when they asked of the jar, she would smile and say, "We carry the small light ourselves." Above, the gods watched the world ripple with new texture. Zeus felt neither victory nor simple anger. His face was a study in distance. He had taught a lesson wrapped as a gift, and the lesson had found its way into the bones of the world. Prometheus, chained upon his mountain, felt the wind bring news of the new things down below. He did not rejoice. He did not gloat. He listened, and in the soft language of stone, he heard laughter threaded with sorrow, and a tiny light flickering in the chest of humankind. Hope, small and patient, moved through the towns and the wild places like a slow tide. It did not erase pain. It softened it, shaped it into stories that could be held. And so the human heart learned to hold both the wound and the ember. In the dim hours, when the fire burned low and the world seemed vast and uncertain, the simple memory of that last gift, a warmth kept in a palm, became the quiet companion for many nights to come. The years turned as quietly as wind turning leaves. Villages became towns, and towns slowly remembered the footprints of those who came before. A child who had touched the flame learned to carve a flute. An elder who had once seen a harvest fail taught a neighbor how to save seed for lean winters. The small practices of daily life grew into customs. The customs became rites. The rites folded into songs that people hummed as they slept by their hearths. Night after night, under the patient watch of stars, stories gathered around the fires. They piled like warm stones, each one lending its heat to the next. People told of Prometheus, the godlike friend who had given them light, of Pandora, whose hands had opened sorrow and left hope. They told these tales not like histories to be judged, but like lullabies meant to keep the dark soft and known. With each telling, the world learned its shape. Names settled like gentle markers: Zeus, the loud sky; Demeter, keeper of grain, Hestia, guardian of the hearth. In these names, people found ways to speak their joys and their complaints, their thanks and their small rebellions. The gods became mirrors in which humans could recognize their own thunders and mercies. Dreams began to change. Where once sleep had been an empty cave, now it became a bridge. In dreams, men and women wandered through fields that remembered the hands that planted them. They walked beneath stars that knew the songs their grandmothers had hummed. Children dreamed of giants who once fashioned mountains, or of gentle spirits who brushed the leaves while they played. Art followed. A girl painted the curve of a wave on clay. A potter etched a likeness of the moon. A poet, by the light of a small flame, composed a line that later grew into a chorus sung by whole villages. Beauty was not a sudden flourish of the gods alone anymore. It was a habit, a slow cultivation, a way of tending the tender places inside people. With creation comes responsibility. The first sparks of industry brought new comforts and new dangers. A blacksmith who learned to temper iron could build a stronger plow and a sharper spear. A farmer who burned a field to coax new growth might find the soil kinder for a season and poorer for the next. Each choice was a small echo of Prometheus's theft, a movement of will into the world whose consequence could be gentle or fierce. So songs taught restraint as well as courage. Mothers hummed not only to soothe but to warn. Tend the earth with care. Do not let pride blind your hands. In time, entire festivals marked seasons of planting and harvest, of remembering those who had perished and thanking those who remained. People began to leave small offerings at altars, a bit of grain, a carved figurine, gestures that tied them to something larger than themselves. And the gods, whether from Olympus's golden halls or from the hush of their own quiet places, listened. They felt, with a slow, astonished tenderness, the patterns human life made. The way laughter could heal a wound, the way a story could teach patience, the way sorrow could open a path to new kindness. Not all gods were pleased. Some still preferred the neat order of obedience. But others, who remembered the taste of the old earth, saw that this mingling of fire and flesh was changing the face of the world in ways both humble and profound. Prometheus, still bound, felt the tremor of those small changes. When a child in a distant valley learned to knit flame into bread, a fragment of that joy reached him like warmth through stone. Sometimes, in the soft gray hours between night and day, birds would bring a scrap of song that had been sung by a family across the sea, and Prometheus would hum along beneath his chains. These were the moments that held him, like a small ember kept in a palm. Pandora, too, walked among people as one who had learned the cost of a curious hand. She sat with widows and with lovers, listening as they unspooled the wefts of their days. She taught that hope was not a cure but a companion. It did not promise to erase pain, but to make it bearable, to lend a light sufficient for the next step. People learned to carry it like a small lamp in a sack, lighting the way through the forest of their lives. The tapestry of myth wove itself more tightly with each passing generation. Heroes arose not as invincible figures but as examples, humans who had reached too far or who had reached true. Their stories were told in breathy evenings, their names carved into stone, their journeys used as maps for the heart. Perseus, who faced a monster, Orpheus, who sang to the bones, Heracles, who bore unbearable tasks. These were not distant gods but worn travelers whose paths any brave listener might try to follow. As time flowed, always slower than the people at its banks imagined, the age of simple villages passed into the age of grander cities. Stone replaced wood in some places, law replaced custom in others. Empires grew like rings around a spreading tree. With the rise of cities came new gods' faces and new names, yet the old stories lingered, braided into the city's very mortar. In quiet moments, when the rush of market and the clang of arms fell away, people returned to the hearth and the tale. They passed the old songs to one another like a slow, necessary medicine. And so it was that the flame Prometheus had stolen, the jar Pandora had opened, and the hope they kept tucked away, all three became part of the same long breath of human memory. Tonight, as you sit or lie, with your eyes soft and your breath even, imagine those first fires. Imagine the hush after Prometheus's step, the soft spill of hardships from a jar, the gentle, stubborn ember of hope resting in a palm. Let those images move through you like a warm current. The dawn of dreams was not a single moment. It was a million small awakenings, each one a quiet vow to continue. Sleep now. Let the stories travel slow and deep into you. Dream of clay and flame, of jars and lamps, of hands, both mortal and divine, that shaped a world into being. Echoes of love and loss. In the soft heart of the world, where seeds sleep under the skin of the earth, there was once a girl named Persephone, daughter of Demeter, goddess of grain and harvest. She was laughter in motion, her voice a ripple that could coax buds from branches. Wherever she walked, spring followed. Wildflowers waking, streams loosening from ice, wind sweetening around her steps. The people called her the Bright One. To her mother, she was the very breath of the seasons, the reason for growth, for warmth, for life. But far below the green skin of the world lay another realm. Shadowed, silent, endless. There ruled Hades, lord of the underworld. Stern, solitary, yet not cruel. His halls were carved of onyx and bone, lit by ghostly rivers that shimmered like mirrors of memory. Hades had watched the living world from afar. He had seen its laughter, its chaos, its bright impermanence. And he had seen Persephone, her hair gold as ripened wheat, her joy unburdened by time. For a being surrounded by stillness, she was a glimpse of something impossible: renewal. One morning, as Persephone gathered flowers with her friends in a sunlit meadow, the earth itself sighed. A low tremor, like a pulse too deep to hear, shivered through the grass. Then, with a rumble that was not quite thunder, the ground split open, a wound in the meadow's heart. From the rift rose a chariot black as midnight, its wheels wreathed in mist. Hades stood within, tall and still, his eyes a calm that hid longing. The others fled. Persephone alone froze, a bloom still in her hand. Before she could breathe, the chariot surged forward. The earth closed above it, and sunlight vanished into shadow. Below, the world of the dead received its queen. The air was cool and fragrant with myrrh. Pale flowers glowed faintly in the half-dark. Souls drifted past, whispering like leaves in water. "Do not fear," Hades said, his voice low and even. "No harm will come to you here." Persephone did not answer. Her gaze wandered over the halls, the rivers, the quiet fields where the dead rested. "It is beautiful," she said at last softly, "but it is sad." Hades inclined his head. "It is both." Above, Demeter searched the empty fields. She called her daughter's name through mountains, forests, and towns. Crops withered where her tears fell. Rivers slowed. Trees forgot how to bloom. The earth began to starve. The other gods watched uneasily. The world's balance was unraveling. At last, Helios, the sun, who sees all things, came to Demeter and spoke the truth. It was Hades who took her, by Zeus's silent leave. Demeter went to Olympus, her grief a storm. "Give me back my child," she said to Zeus. "Without her, nothing will grow." Zeus frowned. "The underworld needs a queen," he said. "There must be order even in shadow." "Then let shadow starve with the living," Demeter answered, and she left him in silence. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The earth turned gray and thin. Even the gods felt hunger in the air. At last Zeus relented. He sent Hermes, quick-footed, clear-eyed, to bring Persephone back. When Hermes reached the underworld, he found Persephone seated beside Hades. Her hands were folded, calm. Her gaze met his without surprise. "Your mother waits," said Hermes gently. "She has stopped the world for you." Hades looked away. "Then go," he said. "The living must have their light." But before she rose, Persephone glanced toward a small tree heavy with red fruit. She plucked one pomegranate, split it, and ate 6 seeds. Small, bright, sweet as memory. When Hermes saw this, his face fell. "You have eaten of this world," he said softly. "You belong to it now." Persephone looked at the dark river beyond the palace. "Then let me belong to both," she said. And so it was decreed. 6 months she would spend with her mother, bringing spring and summer to the earth. 6 months she would return to Hades, cloaking the world in autumn and winter. Each year, her leaving was sorrow. Each return, a rebirth. And in this rhythm, the world learned patience, the art of dying and beginning again. The farmers saw it in their fields. Lovers felt it in their hearts. Even the gods, in their timeless watch, bowed to the simple cyclical truth that loss is not the end of love, but its shadow, and that the shadow, when touched by light, becomes something like grace. The story of Persephone was told for centuries beside fires, under blankets, in whispers before sleep. And always the ending was the same, the promise of return. When Persephone vanished into the earth, Demeter's grief did not take the shape of loud lament. It was a slow, patient quiet that spread like frost over pond and field. She walked the valleys with her hands empty, and where she no longer tended the wheat with the same gentle care. She did not sing to the seeds. Her hands, once sure as the turning of the seasons, trembled. The soil closed its palms. Shoots curled and slept deeper. Farmers woke to find their granaries lighter. Mothers hushed their children when the wind carried an unfamiliar chill. Markets fell quiet. Laughter thinned. Even the cities seemed to hold their breath. Demeter wandered the earth disguised, a woman draped in plain cloth, her hair unbraided, her face worn with an ancient sorrow. She learned the shape of human grief by living within it. She sat beside hearths and listened. She walked the lanes and watched how people folded their days in on themselves, conserving warmth, saving grain for an uncertain tomorrow. In the faces she saw the edge of fear, that quiet, stubborn thing that makes small decisions, to plant less seed, to mend a roof rather than replace it, to tell children stories that teach patience. In a small town she came upon a kindly couple named Metanera, and her husband took her into their home without knowing who she was. Their child, Demophoon, slept fitfully with a fever. Demeter, moved by a strange affection, took the boy in her arms. At night she anointed him with oil and pressed him to her breast. She whispered to his bones as if whispering to the seeds beneath the earth. The child grew stronger beneath her care, and Demeter, who had forgotten how to be mother in the rough human way, felt something like the return of her own heart. For a time, she almost forgot the dark places below. She taught Metanera how to bake bread in new ways, to save seed through winter, to coax reluctant shoots into life with a steady hand. She taught that tending the earth was a prayer as much as a duty, a slow worship of return. Yet the gods above watched all of this unfold. Zeus felt the strain of an empty world. Merchants petitioned. Sailors complained of lean harvests. Even the halls of Olympus, golden though they were, carried the thinness of bread made small. He called a council, and the voices there were uneasy. She will not relent, Hera said, her voice quiet as a closing door. She will not let the earth wake while her child remains in darkness. Zeus paced. I cannot command Hades without consequence, he said. He tends his realm as I tend mine. Then make a bargain, Athena suggested, though even wisdom spoke low in such matters. So a bargain was shaped, as old bargains must be, compromise born of need. Persephone would be allowed to return for half the year, Zeus declared. The underworld would keep her for the remainder. Balance would be maintained. But nothing could hurry Demeter's healing. She had seen how easily life could be folded into shadow. Even when word came that her daughter would someday come again, she did not immediately lift the blanket of winter. She stayed, teaching and walking, seeding new customs among the people she had met. She showed them how to bury part of their grain so that the soil might remember its duty. She taught that offerings placed quietly at hearths were not empty gestures but small contracts between human hands and the generous earth. From these acts grew a secret, gentle knowledge. Rites that honored the turning of the year, songs sung in low voices in the dark. People gathered in small circles to share bread and remember those who had gone, to light a candle and say a name. These modest rituals became the first threads of what later would be called the mysteries. A soft, private remembering that taught how to hold loss without letting it unravel the heart. In the fields, the absence of Demeter's full blessing made itself known in modest ways. Springs lost some of their hurry. Apples were fewer. But people learned to arrange their lives around scarcity with dignity. They stored grain in earthen jars, mended tools by lamplight, and walked to the wells together, exchanging small comforts. In that mutual tending of the small things, they discovered a communal courage they had not needed before. Demeter watched all this like a mother learning what it meant to trust her children to be adults. She taught them the patience of seasons, the value of a saved seed. When a village would forget and burn a field too soon, she would let the soil speak, and the consequences would be felt in hunger and in the hush that followed. People learned to read the earth's mood the way sailors learned to read the stars. The story of loss, however painful, shaped a new kind of compassion among mortals. Where once life had seemed only to yield bounty, it now taught that attention was required. To plant with thought, to harvest with humility, to share when a neighbor had less. Small altars appeared at crossroads and by wells, cradling bits of grain and tokens woven by small hands. Pilgrims walked at certain times toward places where Demeter's name was remembered, and there they offered their thanks for what had returned. Gradually, slowly as thawing ice, Demeter's heavy heart eased. Her wanderings taught her that humans, with all their failures and small mercies, were learning a language she had not thought to teach them before: how to turn loss into a pattern of care. She began to reawaken parts of the land, not with a careless abundance but with measured return. A thin green would appear where there had been none. A single field would push up wheat in stubborn defiance of frost. It was never as it had been before Persephone's descent, but it had a dignity of its own. When at last Persephone took her first steps back into the light, the welcome was quiet but deep. Mothers wept softly into their aprons. Elders nodded as if a promise had been kept. The world did not explode into sudden blue, and Demeter, who had learned the slow curriculum of patience, allowed herself to smile as she tended the seedbeds. She had been taught that grief could teach industry, and that the careful tending of small things could feed cities. She had seen gardens grow not only from soil but from ritual and the steady rhythm of human hands. In the years that followed, the tale of Demeter's silence and return became a nighttime teaching. That loss need not mean the end of desire, and that sometimes the deepest care is a quiet, unwavering work. The steady, patient tending that keeps a world alive through seasons of hunger. Long after Demeter's sorrow softened into the rhythm of seasons, another story rose from the hum of the mortal world. A story woven not in soil, but in sound. In a small kingdom near the edge of the Aegean lived a man named Orpheus. Some said his mother was Calliope, the muse of epic poetry. Others whispered he was born of mortal parents, blessed by Apollo himself. Whatever the truth, Orpheus carried within him a music that could move the air itself. His lyre was simple, 7 strings stretched across polished wood, but when he played, the world stilled. Trees leaned closer. Rivers slowed their run to listen. Even the stones seemed to hum faintly, remembering the sound long after the song had ended. Orpheus played not for fame, nor for worship, but because music was his way of understanding the world. Each note was a question, each melody a small attempt at peace. Then came Eurydice. She was no goddess, no muse, only a woman who walked through the fields barefoot, hair catching the gold of afternoon. The first time Orpheus saw her, she was laughing with the ease of someone who had never learned fear. He played a chord, soft, unintentional, and the sound seemed to follow her like a memory that refused to fade. They loved as the simple love, quietly, wholly, without ornament. The people said that when they walked together through the hills, even the wind gentled to let them pass. Orpheus would play, and Eurydice would hum along, her voice not trained but true. But joy, like every living thing, is fragile. One morning, Eurydice wandered alone through the tall grass. A shadow slid beneath her step. A serpent startled from its rest. The bite was swift. She fell silently among the wildflowers, her breath leaving her body like a soft sigh returning to the wind. When Orpheus found her, the world was suddenly too still. The lyre slipped from his hands. No sound, no song, only the ache of what had been taken. For days he did not play. The people left food at his door, but he ate nothing. He sat by the river, staring into its glassy surface, as if he might see her reflection rise again. When he finally lifted his lyre, the sound that came was unlike any the world had ever known. It was not music meant to delight or praise. It was a wound made audible, low, trembling, unbearably human. The gods heard it. The trees wept resin. Even the stones along the path grew slick with dew. And when he sang, the song was a plea, not to live without sorrow, but to follow it. So Orpheus did what no mortal had dared. He descended into the realm of Hades, seeking the woman he loved. He walked through caverns where no flame burned, past rivers of shadow and fields where pale souls drifted in endless murmurs. The ferryman Charon, grim and silent, refused passage until Orpheus played. The song wound through the darkness like silver smoke, and the oarsman, tears streaking the hollow of his cheeks, let him board without payment. The underworld listened. The hound Cerberus, three-headed guardian of the gates, lay down and closed its eyes. The Furies wept softly, their whips gone still. Even Hades himself lifted his gaze when the mortal appeared, music still trembling from his fingers. "Why have you come here?" Hades asked, his voice calm as the river Lethe. "For love," Orpheus said simply. "She is the half of every song I have ever played." Hades studied him, the mortal whose grief had softened every boundary. Beside him stood Persephone, her face brightened by the memory of her own long-ago longing for the light. She spoke first. "Play," she said. "Let us hear what love sounds like." Orpheus raised his lyre. The music that followed was quieter than prayer. It spoke of beginnings, of laughter shared in meadows, of hands reaching across night. It told of the day love was born, and of the day it died, and of the space between, filled with the aching beauty of what it means to have lived at all. When the last note faded, there was no sound in the hall of Hades, not even the sighing of the dead. Persephone's eyes glistened. Hades sat unmoving, but the air around him trembled slightly, like stone remembering its own origins in fire. "Take her," he said at last, "but obey this one condition. You must not look back until you both have reached the light." Orpheus bowed in gratitude. He found Eurydice waiting by the riverbank, her form faint but still herself. She smiled, that same small smile he had thought lost to time, and they began the long ascent. The path upward was narrow, carved in shadow. Behind him, he could hear her footsteps, soft as breath, steady as a heartbeat. But doubt, that oldest companion of love, began to creep into his mind. Was she truly there? Was he leading only silence? The tunnel began to lighten. Ahead, the first shimmer of daylight glowed like a promise. He stepped forward, 1, 2, 3 more paces, and then, unable to bear it, turned. For a moment he saw her. Her eyes met his, filled with sorrow and forgiveness at once. Then she was gone, pulled backward, vanishing into the dark, her name dissolving into the hush that followed. Orpheus stood alone at the threshold, the light trembling across his face. He did not cry out. He simply lowered his head and stepped into the daylight, his heart carrying the echo of that final glance. In time, he wandered again through the mortal world, but his music was changed. It no longer sought to charm or persuade. It existed like a river remembering its source, gentle, slow, infinitely patient. He played not for crowds, but for the evening itself, for the stars that came quietly, for the memory of a voice now part of the wind. The people said that even after his death, his lyre continued to sing on its own, strings trembling when the night was clear, carrying a melody that could still the heart. Some said it was the voice of Eurydice calling. Others said it was love itself, reminding the world that loss is not the opposite of beauty, but its shadow, soft, inevitable, and holy. They say that when Orpheus finally laid down his lyre, the world itself paused to listen to his silence. The wind slowed, the birds stopped mid-song, even the rivers dimmed their voices to a murmur, as though the earth itself bowed its head for what had passed. When he crossed into the realm beyond life, no ferryman asked for coin. The waters parted for him, carrying him gently across. For the first time since his loss, he did not look back. The shadows around him hummed faintly, the echo of his own songs, drifting through the stillness like candlelight that refuses to go out. They led him to the field where souls rest before they are born again. It was quiet there, but not empty. The air shimmered faintly, as if filled with sound too soft for mortal ears. And in that light, standing beside the river, he saw Eurydice. No words were spoken. None were needed. They met as music meets silence, not to fill it, but to make it whole. Together, they stepped into the river Lethe, the river of forgetting. But when the water touched them, something strange happened. The river, which should have erased all memory, began instead to sing. It sang the songs Orpheus had played, every note, every sorrow, every tenderness. For his music had changed the underworld itself. The water could not make him forget, could only remember differently. In time, the myths say, his lyre was placed among the stars, its 7 strings burning faintly in the heavens, forever visible to travelers and dreamers who look up in silence. Some call it the constellation Lyra, but others, older still, call it the heart of Orpheus. From there, his music continued to drift down to the earth, not as sound, but as feeling. In the hush before dawn, when the world seems to breathe but has not yet awakened, that is when his melody is closest. In the pulse of a heartbeat slowed by sleep, in the rhythm of rain against glass, in the sigh of wind through leaves, that is where Orpheus still plays. His story, like that of Demeter and Persephone, taught humankind something no god had intended, that the divine was not just in lightning and thunder, but in the fragile courage to love even when loss is certain. The Greeks, who once feared the tempers of their gods, began to sense a new kind of holiness, quiet, human, tender. They built small shrines not of marble, but of memory. They told their children that to live well was to remember beauty, even when it had passed. And so, through song and silence, through grief and return, the myths began to change. They became gentler, more inward, stories not of power, but of understanding. Orpheus had not conquered death. He had taught it how to listen. Those who dreamed deeply at night began to see strange things, visions of the underworld not as terror, but as a place of reflection. Fields of asphodel glowing softly like moonlit snow, rivers whispering the names of those once loved. Some said they could hear a faint melody in their sleep, guiding them through the dream as if by invisible hand. The ancients began to tell their dead not to fear the journey. Drink from the river, they would whisper, but do not forget who you were. Carry the song. In that time, temples grew quieter. The grand rituals gave way to smaller, humbler ones. A loaf of bread shared at sunset, a bowl of milk left by the window, a song sung for those who had gone. In each act, there was a remembrance that even loss could be beautiful when met with love. The poets called this the age of reverence, when humans learned to hold their grief with grace. They believed that every soul, upon leaving the world, carried a single note within it, and together, those notes formed the eternal music of the stars. And so, night after night, as the constellations wheeled above, the people looked up and saw the lyre shining faintly among them. They told their children that when they felt sorrow, they could whisper to the sky, and the stars would hum back softly, reminding them that every love, every loss, every ending was part of a greater, unbroken song. Some say the gods themselves listened, that even Zeus, who once hurled thunder to shape the world, would sometimes sit in silence and feel the smallness of his own heart against the vastness of what humans had made with nothing but their breath and longing. It is said that when the Romans came, they too adopted these stories, but something in them had changed. The thunder had softened. The gods were now closer, more human. They laughed and quarreled, loved and mourned. And perhaps that was the final gift of Orpheus. Not that he bridged the living and the dead, but that he taught the divine how to feel. Now, when the night deepens and the stars drift into clarity, you can still find him. The faint shimmer of Lyra high above, steady, patient, eternal. Listen closely and you might hear it too. A music so soft it's more like a breath than a sound. It says, you are loved, you are remembered, and every sorrow will someday become a song. The wind's quiet, the world exhales, The story sleeps again, waiting for the next dreamer to remember. The Age of Heroes. Over time, the quiet work of seasons and the slow stitching of human custom gave rise to a subtle change in the world. A change that could not be named at first, but felt like a new tone under an old song. Mortals had learned to keep fires and to keep hope. They had learned to sing the soft songs of memory and to plant seeds with patience. Yet among them, certain hearts grew restless in a way that was neither greedy nor merely curious. They felt a pull toward something larger than their own fields, a responsibility that pressed on the ribs like a steady hand. These were the people who would later be called heroes, not because they were born perfect or because the gods had made them invincible, but because they carried, in different measures, a kind of courage that asked them to go where ordinary life would not. The gods noticed them as gods do. Sometimes they stepped in like a warm wind, an unexpected guide, a quiet favor, a dream that taught the path. Sometimes they stood aside, letting the mortal will shape itself without divine hand. And sometimes, in a way both tender and severe, the gods gave tests, not to break the heart, but to teach it. Among these early heroes, one name that the world repeated was Perseus, a young man whose life folded into the shape of a long, bright story. But if you listen closely, his tale is less about blood and more about the soft persistence of kindness. Perseus was born at the edge of ordinary things. His mother, Danae, lived quietly, sheltered by a father's fear and a fate that felt like a closed door. Yet from the margin of that small life, the boy grew, curious, gentle, the sort of child who would watch the sea for hours until the gulls tired of him and the waves settled into answers. Fate, in the older sense, is often less tidy than the songs say. Perseus found himself given a task that smelled of thunder: to bring back the head of Medusa, a woman whose face had been turned into a thing of terror. But the simple truth beneath the roar was different. Medusa had once been a person who suffered. The gods had shaped her into warning, and the world had learned to fear what used to be human. Perseus did not set out to be a destroyer. He accepted the tools the gods placed quietly at his side: a mirrored shield, a small satchel, winged sandals, a cloak that could hide him, and he wrapped them around his purpose like a traveler wraps himself against night. He moved with tenderness. When he approached the place that guarded the sleeping Gorgons, he kept his softest breath and let the shine of his shield stand in for looking straight on. In the mirror, he saw not a monstrous face but a life turned hard by cruelty. The myth knows the moment in jerks of drama: the stone, the head, the rush of escape. But if you soften its edges, you can hear something else: the hush of sadness, and the way a young man shouldered a terrible kindness, carrying danger so others would not have to. On his return, he found Andromeda, chained to a rock by an old bargain, waiting not with fear alone but with a patient grief. He freed her not to earn a crown, but because suffering had become intolerable to look at. The world told their names together then, Perseus and Andromeda, and sang of how one small life could change a tide of sorrow. And in the telling, people learned a quiet lesson: that to be heroic is sometimes to be the one who can stand looking at pain without turning away. Other stories followed similar tracks. Theseus, who walked to the center of a labyrinth and found his way home by remembering the faces of those he loved. Jason, whose ship carried a ragged band of the willing, a collection of ordinary men with soft, steadfast hearts. Heracles, whose labors would be told like a breath lesson, strength leavened with the cost of action. Each hero walked in different light, but all moved toward what the world needed: an example that tenderness and resolve could live in the same chest. The Age of Heroes did not erase the gods. It layered on top of them a human insistence. We can answer our own small calls and still sing the names of the gods when the night is very deep. The heroes became the middle path between Olympus and the hearth. They taught people how to be large without forgetting how to be gentle. Around evening fires, parents told their children these stories as both entertainment and instruction. They shaped the tales not to glorify violence but to teach the long arc of consequence. Action yields price. Courage yields learning. Even when a hero did something terrible, the songs softened the edges, showing the human cost and the way the heart can be mended or broken. In the quiet of the world, so many small things changed because of these lives. A path through a dark would remain lit for a generation because someone had once carried a lantern. A village that had nearly forgotten its rights relearned them because a hero had taught the value of remembrance. A mother who had no bread saw strangers share theirs because long ago a hero had shown how to give. And the gods, who had given and taken in equal measures, learned too. Where once they might have only struck with thunder, some of them began to watch the slow, steady work of humans with an unfamiliar warmth. They found that mortals could grow wiser not simply by following orders, but by facing uncertainty with steady hands. So the era unfolded, not as a parade of trophies, but as a ribbon of lives that touched many others, each touch shaping the next. The heroes were not flawless. They failed, and sometimes they harmed. But through every failure, humans and gods learned the same tender lesson again and again. That courage, when married to compassion, yields a softer world. Rest now, and let the image of the quiet hero sit with you. A lamp carried through the dark, not to conquer it with noise, but to show a single unafraid path for another to follow. In the long weave of hero tales, Heracles shines like a large, complicated flame, bright, a little wild, and always warm at the edges. But if you sit near it and listen closely, you'll notice another thing. A soft crackle underscoring the blaze, as if the fire remembers the wood it burned. Heracles was called son of Zeus, and his life began in a mixture of thunder and tenderness. He was a man of great strength, enormous in the way that things grown in storms can be enormous. The stories name his tasks as the 12 labors, each a poem of danger and endurance. We remember the lion whose hide could not be pierced by arrows, the hydra whose heads multiplied like worries, the boar that rooted the earth until the soil itself cried fatigue. These images are dramatic, big enough to take breath away. But the quieter truth, the one that sits like an ember when the large fires die down, is about how every task taught Heracles the shape of consequence. He did not always act from wisdom. There were moments when anger moved him like a storm, breaking what lay in its path. Those are the parts of his tale that remind listeners why myths exist. To show both splendor and sorrow, to teach by example the cost of untempered force. After such times, when the ash settled, Heracles often found himself learning the tender chores of repair, tending wounds, rebuilding a burned field, or sitting in silence with someone he had wronged. In one softer telling of his life, after a night of rage humbled into regret, Heracles walked to a small village and helped an old potter rebuild his kiln. He learned how to mix clay so it would not crack, how to feel the right moment to ease a shaped pot into the oven. The work taught him patience. The kiln demanded waiting, and waiting asked for care. In such small deeds, strength was not measured in how much could be lifted, but in how gently hands could lay something back into place. Another labor sent him to fetch the cattle of a far-off king, a task full of danger. Yet along the way, Heracles sat by a riverside and listened to the song of a woman spinning thread. He learned the rhythm of that quiet craft, and on the long road that followed, the memory of the spinning's slow, persistent motion helped steady him when storms rose. It is a little thing, a remembered song, but it shows how the human heart often finds its lessons in unexpected places. The labors were also a kind of medicine, imposed and chosen both, that shaped him into someone who could hold more than brute force. Each task pulled him through fear toward an understanding of limit and care. When he wrestled the monstrous, he learned to respect the small. When he carried the sky for a short, tender moment to relieve an ally, he felt the weight of responsibility and the quiet reward of shared burden. People around him began to tell stories not only of his strength but of the afternoons he spent teaching children how to lift little stones without hurting their backs, or the night he stoked the embers of a dying fire for a family who had lost their home. These images, told softly beside hearths, made the hero accessible, not a distant god, but a neighbor who had once walked through terrible storms and returned with hands that knew how to mend. The gods observed with mixed feeling. Hera, who had long memories and a sharp edge of resentment toward Heracles for being the son of Zeus by another, watched the man's life with something that sometimes softened into respect. Even Zeus, who had in him great sky troubles and a kind of lonely thunder, felt pride complicated by sorrow when he saw Heracles choosing to help where he might easily have destroyed. In the end, The lessons of Heracles are not simple triumphs. They are weathered truths, courage tempered by self-awareness, strength guided by tenderness, action paired with the humility to repair what is broken. When he finally passed beyond the world of sun and seed, the poet said he did so not as a god taking a place of honor, but as a man who had learned much and still felt the ache of all he had done. His life became a tool for teaching, a set of stories told to quiet fevered children or to steady a frightened apprentice at night. Parents spoke of how even the mightiest must learn to be careful with their own power, how to listen before striking, how to carry the burden of consequence with steady hands. And so, by firelight and in low voices, families repeated the tales. Heracles' labors were softened into lessons, and those lessons folded into the fabric of daily life. Strength could be a kind companion if it was guided by a heart that made room for gentleness. Rest now with that image. A large man kneeling to line a kiln, the smoke curling away like a quiet hand. Let the warmth hold you, and let the idea sink in that bravery can be quiet, and that a strong heart can learn to be soft. Two names that travel together in the quiet telling of old tales are Theseus and Jason, each walking different paths, each teaching the world how courage and care might look when worn like everyday clothes. Their stories are not loud trumpets. They are small lamps held steady through mist. Theseus grew up on the shores of Athens, a boy with a curious patience. He learned the sea's moods and the city's soft rhythms. The story often told is of a labyrinth and a monstrous heart called the Minotaur. But if you slow the tale down, you find a child who wanted to make his city kinder and less burdened by old cruelties. The people of Athens once offered youths to a far-off palace as part of a harsh bargain. Theseus could not accept that customs should chain the young to suffering. So he sailed, not to win glory, but to end a cruelty that had become ordinary. He entered the labyrinth with a calm breath and a simple thread given by someone who loved him, a small thing that would guide him back. He did not boast when he returned. He walked into the market and sat under an olive tree, letting the news ripple through the city like a warm current. People came with questions and hands reaching to touch a man who had unmade a sorrow. Parents told their children his name not so they might imitate daring, but so they might remember that even the most complex of problems can sometimes be solved by careful thought and a willingness to accept help. Jason's song is different but related. He gathered a company, the Argonauts, ordinary men and women called by a purpose that required trust more than boldness. They went in search of a golden fleece, not for greed, but because the fleece was part of a pact, a righting of an old wrong. Jason's strength lay not in his solitary heroics, but in his ability to ask for aid and to hold together a fragile fellowship. On that voyage there were storms, yes, but there were long, quiet watches as well. Men mending sails by starlight, a woman teaching a youth how to tie a knot so it would not slip, friends sharing bread and a small fire. When they reached the place of the fleece, it was not force that won the day but patience and careful listening to one another's strengths. Both stories teach similar small truths. Theseus shows how a single person can change an unjust practice by choosing a different path, not through fury, but through resolve and help. Jason teaches that leadership is often the art of gathering hearts, of sowing disparate courage into a pattern that will not unravel in the first wind. In quiet homes, parents told these tales to their children like instructions in gentle politics. How to stand up to a wrong without becoming the thing you oppose. How to build a team not for trophies but for repair. Children learned that a hero could be the one who knew how to listen and the one who returned with less fanfare and more care. Both heroes also carried private sorrows. Theseus' later years softened into complexity, choices made that left him with questions about pride and consequence. Jason's love for Medea brought rescue and ruin, reminding listeners that even brave hearts make mistakes when love and need twist together. These were not endings of black and white. They were reminders that life's threads tangle, and that wisdom includes learning how to mend them. The gods watched these stories ripple outward. Some of them, those who loved order, favored the clean ending. Others, those who loved human mischief and growth, were pleased to see mortals practice gentleness under pressure. In the telling, the myths softened edges. The hero's errors became lessons taught at the fireside. The small rescues and quiet leadership became the true prizes. Over time, Theseus and Jason turned from names on the tongue to ideas in the mind. The courage to change a custom, the patience to gather allies. Their lives taught that heroism need not humiliate its victims, that leadership might be humble, and that the heart must often be mended after doing what needed to be done. So as the years moved like slow water, the age of heroes settled into memory. People still told of labyrinths and long sails, but the songs now lingered on the small human moments. A thread pulled through dark, a hand offered at dawn. The lessons folded into the quiet architecture of the world, shaping how towns cared for their own, how leaders were expected to guide, and how love could be both blessing and burden. Rest with that gentle image. A sailor mending a rope by lamplight, a youth rolling out a length of thread to mark his way home. Let these small acts of patience and care slip into your shoulders and release the day. Time in those. The labors were finished. The voyages reached their harbors. Some heroes found peace in small villages, teaching crafts or tending gardens. Others left the world in ways that felt more like departures than endings. A boat slipping from a shore at dawn, a figure walking alone into a thin mist. Their myths did not vanish. They thinned, like morning fog, revealing more of the human landscape beneath. People began to build differently. Walls rose that were meant to endure. Roads were laid that joined towns into networks. Where once a man might make his name by a single bold deed, now a community measured worth by how well houses sheltered, how clean the water ran, how children learned to read the stars. Daily life took on a civic rhythm that required more than one strong arm or a single brave heart. It required steadiness across many hands. The old rites continued but settled into new contexts. Festivals honoring gods and heroes became times to remember lessons rather than to celebrate conquest. The telling of a hero story might pause to speak of what was lost, and then of what was repaired. Songs softened into instruction, how to live with loss, how to work in common, how to pass on care. Children learned that courage lived not only in battle but in staying to rebuild. The gods watched these changes with a complex tenderness. Some felt ignored, as if the world's eyes had shifted from the peak of Olympus to the slow, populous streets below. Others listened with surprise and quiet joy as small human communities learned to carry the weight of life among themselves. The divine presence did not leave so much as it changed its tone. Less thunder, more watchful quiet. Less dramatic sweeping of fate, more subtle shaping of character. In the later years of the hero's age, there were still moments of great drama. A battle that decided the fate of a border, a storm that tested the seamanship of a whole fleet. But these events were woven into larger tapestries of everyday care. When war came, it was met with strategies born of long practice. When famine struck, neighbors had already learned how to share. Institutions grew around these practices. Councils that met not for display but for planning harvests. Guilds that shared tools and skills. Gatherings that trained the young not only to fight but to heal. The story of the last heroes folded into the story of the first towns. Monuments were raised, yes, but many memorials were simple. A stone with a name, an oak planted in memory, a bowl left at a threshold. People preferred this quiet memorializing because it fit the new shape of virtue. Unobtrusive, steady, and communal. And so the hero's age ended not with a single, shattering trumpet, but with a long, gentle dimming. Like a long candle that burns low and then relents into the room's overall light. The lessons remained. To act with compassion, to accept consequence, to mend what is broken. Those who had been young in the age of heroes grew to be elders who taught by story and example. Their children and grandchildren kept the small practices alive and, in time, adapted them for larger towns and new polities. As human settlements grew into states and cities grew into early empires, the stories of heroes became part of civic identity. Leaders invoked them to remind citizens of common duties and shared memory. The names of heroes were called in oaths, in festivals, in lullabies. Sometimes these invocations were used to inspire, sometimes to command. Yet the underlying human teaching remained, courage is best when practiced with humility. And slowly, with the soft insistence of migration and trade, another people moved across the Mediterranean with a different rhythm of rule and a new set of names for old things. They borrowed myths and reshaped them to fit the new order. The old gods kept their faces but gained new words. Heroes carried different titles. This was not theft so much as translation. The stories, like living things, adapted to new languages and new streets. In this time of changing names and wider roads, the voices that once belonged to a single valley now traveled farther. Journeys that used to take seasons could now be made with improved vessels. Ideas moved with travelers who brought songs and tools, seeds and stories. The world folded tighter, and myths that had once been local became threads in a larger cloth. The age closed with a feeling not of loss but of continuation. The brave deeds and quiet lessons of heroes had entered the bloodstream of societies. They lived on in law and custom, in the layout of roads and the keeping of records, in the modest rituals people performed before meals. Even as new names took hold, the old lessons, be gentle with strength, repair harm, love despite risk, moved with them like a small compass guiding uncertain hands. Tonight, as darkness settles and your breath eases, picture the end of the hero's light, not as an extinction, but as a passing of a torch. Imagine hands, old and young, passing a simple lamp from one to another, each promise quiet and bright. Let that image hold you. Let the warmth ease the day from your shoulders. Rest. The world continues. Stories will be told old and new, and in them the small truths endure. The dimming of the divine. The centuries moved like a deep river, wide, patient, hardly claiming urgency. Roads spread, harbors filled with sails, and traders carried not only grain and olives but also stories folded into their cloth. Where a village once kept a tale only for its own hearth, now the same tale might be hummed under a different roof, in a different tongue, and with little shifts that made it fit new ears. In time, the bright peaks of Olympus found new echoes. The gods who had once dwelt in mountain halls began to wear new names on new lips. Zeus became Jupiter in the Latin mouths that rose along the western sea. Athena glided into being as Minerva. Aphrodite breathed as Venus. The faces were familiar and the voices slightly altered, like a song sung in a different key. This change was not sudden or violent. It arrived as a gentle translation. Merchants learning new words for familiar objects, children swapping lullabies with passing sailors, priests borrowing rites that pleased both old and new congregations. People adapted stories the way they adapted tools. Useful things were kept, awkward pieces smoothed, rough edges filed down until they fit the hand. The great cities grew. Stone replaced earth in many places. Markets moved from dusty crossroads to paved forums. Law stretched itself into written codes that people could read by daylight. With these changes came a new kind of reverence, less a storm of sacrifice and more a civic remembering. Temples became not only shrines but also places where a city presented its identity. The gods were invoked in pledges and laws. Their images stood as reminders of values citizens were meant to hold. Priests learned to speak in measured tones. The rituals, once secret and wild in some places, became organized. Processions were timed. Festivals fit the calendar. The divine moved into the architecture of daily life, woven into public duties like the keeping of grain or the timing of marriages. Religion took on a civic rhythm. It helped a city keep itself together. Alongside these practical shifts rose a quieter transformation in how people thought. Philosophers began to ask soft, persistent questions. What does it mean to believe when the gods are also like neighbors and rulers? Is the God in the storm the same as the God in the statute? These questions did not explode into answers. They folded slowly into evenings over wine, into debates in shaded porticos, into the private notebooks of those who loved thought more than clamor. Poets carried the old myths into new poems. They kept the bones of the stories but retold them with a restraint that suited urban ears. The passionate, tempestuous god of mountain tales softened into a symbol of authority and duty when recited in a Senate hall. The old dramas, jealousies, quick tempers, sudden storms, were reframed as lessons about balance and moderation. The divine still moved, but now it often moved as a comment, an example, or a cautionary tale. In the smaller places, villages, islands, lonely farms, the old ways lingered. A shepherd might still leave a crust of bread for a local spirit, A woman might whisper to her hearth as her mother had taught her. The gods there were close in the way a shadow is close at dusk. But as trade routes deepened and tongues mingled, a shared vocabulary of gods emerged that could be used in courts and markets alike. It is important to know that this was not merely loss. It was also an opening. As the gods acquired new names and new faces, people found different ways to speak of what mattered. A Roman magistrate might call upon Jupiter to witness an oath. A Greek farmer might pray to Demeter for a good harvest. Though the language shifted, the underlying human needs, safety, love, memory, remained. And those needs found fitting and useful forms in the new civic rituals. Yet the transformation carried sadness. The raw intimacy between mountain god and lonely worshipper thinned. Where once a person might believe a god walked their fields at dusk, the belief now wore a public face, an agreed story recited in formal places. Some felt this as comfort, a shared framework that a whole city could rely on. Others felt it as a cooling, like watching a fire moved from a family hearth into a grand hall where no single hand could warm it. And so the divine dimmed not in extinction but in translation. Olympus's thunder became Jupiter's law. The songs of lonely nymphs folded into civic festivals. The gods were still there, but they were often more distant, more formal, and sometimes harder to hear beneath the sounds of commerce and governance. Still, in the hush of night, in moonlit courtyards or the quiet of a temple at dawn, the old stories could be felt. They were like a wind that remembered other winds, subtle, insistently present. Men and women who grew up in both worlds learned to carry both languages, the private songs for the hearth and the public words for the forum. This is how the ancient world turned its face toward a new age. The myths traveled, changed, kept their warmth in new patterns. They were braided into law, sung into poems, and preserved in the quiet of mothers' voices. They became, all at once, the scaffold for public life and the private comfort for those who wanted to remember a mountain's solitude. Rest here for a moment with that image. A traveler in a courtyard, learning a song in another tongue, then humming it softly as he lights a lamp at night. The poem survives because the people keep humming. The names may change, but the small ember of meaning passes on. By the time the marble cities reached their height, the gods had already grown quieter. Their images stood taller than ever, carved with greater skill, painted with richer colors, but inside the stone there was stillness, a kind of waiting. The people came, lit their lamps, left their offerings, and bowed their heads. Yet when they lifted their eyes, what they felt was not always the trembling presence of a god, but the echo of a memory that lingered, soft and immense. The temples were magnificent. Columns rose like frozen prayers, courtyards gleamed with light, and fountains spoke in the tongues of running water. The builders worked not only to honor the gods, but also to craft perfection itself. Every shadow, every echo, every scent of burning oil was designed to make mortals feel the edge of eternity. But even amid this splendor, the divine was shifting its shape, from being a living thunder to becoming a symbol of harmony, balance, and beauty. Priests learned to keep their tone serene. They spoke less of miracles and more of meaning. The sacrifices that once carried cries and drums turned into rituals of quiet precision. A drop of wine, a handful of grain, a whispered vow. The worshipper's heart did not always leap with fear or ecstasy anymore. It rested instead in a mood of contemplation, like a man gazing at the sea and feeling both small and at peace. The poets followed this change. They no longer sang only of divine wrath or passion, but of the balance between heaven and humankind. They wrote of how a city mirrors the stars, how its order, its laws, its proportions reflect a cosmic pattern. The gods became architects of harmony rather than storm. They guided the compass more than the thunderbolt. And the people, learning from these poems, began to imagine holiness as a kind of calm intelligence. Yet beneath this serenity, something tender persisted. Ordinary people, those who lived far from marble colonnades, still whispered to the small gods of their gardens and hearths. In kitchen corners, an old woman might murmur a blessing as she stirred the pot. In a vineyard, a man might speak softly to the vines, asking Dionysus for a gentle season. The state might name the gods in Latin and Greek, But in the soil and in the breath of daily work, the old intimacy survived. Travelers crossing from Greece to Rome noticed this contrast. In the cities, religion looked like order. In the villages, it felt like conversation. The same deity could appear majestic in marble and humble in mud. It was said that a god could dwell both in the temple statue and in the puddle reflecting its light, both sacred, both real in their own way. As the Roman world expanded, the temples multiplied. Each new province built its own shrines, blending local spirits with the great Olympians. In Gaul, Jupiter wore a cloak stitched in Celtic patterns. In Egypt, Venus shared a shrine with Isis, and worshippers saw no contradiction. The divine had become multilingual, adaptable, a guest who could wear many faces and still be recognized by the heart. But even as faith widened, the gods' voices grew fainter. Their stories became lessons rather than warnings, symbols rather than presences. The philosophers said this was wisdom, that the divine had always been too vast to be confined to form. They taught that truth itself was a god, and that all temples were merely reflections of the mind's architecture. It was a comforting thought and an elegant one. Yet for those who remembered the old thunder, it carried a quiet sadness, the feeling of hearing an echo where once there was a song. The temples began to hold more silence than prayer. Travelers who entered them at dusk found the air cool and sweet, scented with the day's offerings. Candles flickered, dust rose like pale smoke, and if one stood very still, one could almost believe that the marble eyes watched back. Not judging, not promising, only remembering. The divine was still there, diffused through space and time, patient as the stars. Some poets began to imagine that the gods had not left at all, only withdrawn into the world itself. Zeus became the principle of sky, Aphrodite the impulse of love, Poseidon the rhythm of change. The myths turned inward. What was once story became philosophy. What was once miracle became metaphor. The age of active divinity was closing, but a new age of thought and beauty was blooming in its place. The gods, now silent, became muses for artists, companions for thinkers, and gentle ghosts in the language of the wise. The same figures who once hurled lightning now whispered ideas. The shift was vast, yet almost invisible, like watching a river change its course over centuries, finding a quieter bed to flow in. And so, in that long twilight of faith, the temples stood as reminders that the sacred does not vanish, it changes shape. It moves from thunder to marble, from voice to idea, from fear to reverence. The divine, ever patient, allows itself to be remade so it can keep teaching. Rest, then, with that image. A temple at dusk, columns bathed in amber light, a single flame trembling in the still air. The footsteps have faded. The world hums softly. Somewhere within that quiet, the gods are still listening. Not above, not beyond, but within the hush itself. As the centuries deepened, the old hymns became thoughts, and thoughts became quiet companions of the soul. The gods, who had once moved mountains and stirred seas, began to live within the mind. They did not vanish. They folded inward, becoming ideas, virtues, impulses, and dreams. In Athens, and later in Rome, thinkers walked under colonnades and spoke softly of what remained divine in a world of order and reason. They asked, if Zeus ruled the heavens, who ruled the heart? If Athena guided wisdom, was she not also the light within every act of understanding? Slowly, belief became philosophy. The thunder of Olympus softened into the hum of contemplation. The sacred was no longer something that visited from outside, but something each person could cultivate. Through justice, courage, and truth. The temples still stood, but their echo was matched by another sound. The quiet scratching of stylus on wax, the murmur of teachers and pupils exploring what it meant to live well. The Stoics taught that the divine fire dwelled in every living being, that reason itself was a spark of Zeus, eternal and guiding. To live in harmony with that spark was to honor the gods more fully than by any sacrifice. Virtue became the new altar, conscience the new flame. And when night fell over marble cities, people looked to the stars not to pray for miracles, but to remember their own place in a vast and ordered cosmos. the poets took up this new faith in the self. They wrote that Aphrodite was not only love's goddess but also love's motion. The tenderness in a mother's gaze, the warmth between friends, the first tremor of hope after despair. Ares, the god of war, was not only battle's chaos but the raw pulse of courage that beats in anyone who faces fear. The myths became mirrors. The gods no longer commanded from above. They reflected what already lived inside those who told their stories. Across the Roman world, this quiet revolution grew. Teachers spoke of inner balance, of the soul as a small cosmos, of virtue as a way to align one's being with the harmony of the stars. The old rituals began to fade, but the hunger for meaning did not. People still needed to name what they felt when they looked at the sea or held a newborn child. And so, they turned inward and found the divine waiting there, patient, familiar, smiling. The philosophers said that every heart carried a spark of logos, the divine reason that shaped the world. They told their students that to listen to conscience was to listen to a god, that to act justly was to keep faith with the cosmos itself. There were no thunderbolts in this religion, no trembling omens, only the calm assurance that every good deed was a prayer. Some resisted this inward turn. The priests of the old cults worried that temples would grow empty, that marble and gold would lose their purpose. But even they could not deny that something beautiful was happening. People were learning to be kind without fear of punishment, to act well because goodness felt right in itself. The gods had not been dethroned. They had been invited home, into the chambers of the human heart. Poets and sculptors followed suit. Statues of Jupiter gained softer expressions. Venus began to look less like perfection and more like mercy. Art turned its gaze from heaven to humanity. The divine beauty once found in lightning and marble now glowed in faces, gestures, and eyes. It was said that when a craftsman carved the curve of a hand or the calm of a smile, he was giving form to a god that lived in everyone. In time, the philosophers' language spread beyond the academies. Soldiers learned bits of it from campfire teachers. Merchants used it to find patience on long roads. Mothers whispered its truths to their children at night. The divine was no longer confined to temples or mountaintops. It was in every moment when a person chose kindness over cruelty, honesty over deceit, peace over anger. The gods, once mighty and distant, became companions. They no longer demanded. They inspired. They no longer punished. They reminded. They no longer walked above. They walked within. The myths, once grand dramas, became reflections of daily life. To live justly was to keep faith with Zeus. To think clearly was to honor Athena. To love fully was to remember Aphrodite. And in this quiet inwardness, humanity discovered a new kind of peace. Not the fragile calm of fear appeased, but the deep stillness of understanding. The sacred had not disappeared. It had simply changed address. It had moved from the sky into the soul. At night, when the lamps burned low, a traveler could still look up and whisper to the stars. But the prayer was different now. It was not a plea for favor. It was a promise to live with the same quiet order the heavens displayed, to be kind as the dawn, steady as the sea, true as the turning of the sky. Rest, then, with that image. A philosopher seated in the half-light, eyes half-closed, breathing in rhythm with the world. The city sleeps, the stars watch, and somewhere inside that still heart, the gods breathe too, softly, endlessly, like the tide. The world kept turning, as it always does, bearing names like boats on its back. Empires rose and settled into the dust. Languages shifted like weather, yet some things traveled unchanged. The need to tell a story by firelight, the small ritual of setting bread on a doorstep, the private promise to be kinder than yesterday. As centuries folded into each other, the great myths that had once moved mountains became quieter companions. They no longer needed to shout to be heard. Instead, they took up residence in the gentle rhythms of life, the cadence of a morning prayer, the measured patience of a baker, the soft memory of a grandmother naming the moon. The old gods, now spoken with Roman lips and Greek hearts, found new ways to be useful. They became names for virtues. Jupiter for law and responsibility, Minerva for thought and craft, Venus for the tender risk of opening one's heart. These names were incised into public life, used to teach children, to seal promises, to remind leaders of the weight their choices carried. They were less unpredictable now, but they were nearer in a different way, woven into the civic fabric that kept people alive together. In time, other religions and other voices arrived and took root. Some older rites dimmed, some new lights rose. Yet the stories did not vanish. They adapted. A goddess face might be painted anew. A festival might change its date. But a mother would still hush her child with a story about a kind god or a brave hero. The human habit of turning to story in the dark remained as steady as breath. The greatest quiet miracle was simple. Myths became memory, and memory became comfort. When storms came, literal or the storms of loss, people reached for the old tales like hands reaching for a lamp. They read them not to command the weather, but to steady their own hearts. The gods had moved inside the human field of vision. They lived now in conscience and language, in craft and in consolation. Poets preserved them. Painters kept their faces. Sculptors carved their gestures. Teachers told the tales again and again, not as iron laws but as maps. Here is a way to act. Here is a warning. Here is a soft instruction on how to be a creature that both loves and loses. The myths became tools for living rather than edicts from above. And so the divine, having once been thunder and tempest, now often revealed itself as the small, steady things that make life bearable. A loaf shared with a neighbor, a hand held through mourning, a promise kept. The gods' greatest lesson had perhaps been this. Whether in storm or in silence, presence matters. Presence could be a vast thunderclap or the quiet of someone staying awake while another slept. Both were forms of the sacred. For those who still walked by old ruins or climbed solitary hills at dusk, there was consolation in knowing the gods had not truly disappeared. They had only altered their residence, moving from mountaintop to mind, from spectacle to intimacy. To honor them now was often to be attentive, to listen when someone spoke of fear, to help without spectacle, to remember names and stories so they would not thin into emptiness. The stories traveled beyond their original coasts. They became part of new cultures, new languages, new imaginations. Sailors and traders hummed them in the nights at sea. Farmers retold them in rains. Scholars copied them by the soft light of an oil lamp. They were stitched into laws, painted on public walls, whispered under blankets. Each telling was a small reincarnation, and with every telling the myths changed shape to fit the time and the people who told them. Yet at the center of all these changes lay a steady truth. Myth is memory coded in meaning, and memory is what keeps us from being simply weather. These tales, whether told in Latin or Greek or any other tongue, teach the small practices of being human. How to forgive, how to bear, how to celebrate the brief, bright things. They are lullabies for civilizations as much as for children. And so now, in our time, when you close your eyes and let the hum of the modern world fade, you carry these stories with you. They are not dusty relics but living things, soft lamps to hold in the night. They will not give you certainty, nor will they chase away every shadow. But they will lend you shape for your questions and atone for your grief. They remind you that life's hardest work is often its quietest. To keep faith, to tend, to remember. Let the myths breathe with you. Picture Olympus not as an absent throne but as a reflection in a warm hearth. See Prometheus's small ember glowing in every handmade lamp. Hear Orpheus's faint melody when the rain drums at your window. Feel Persephone's patient rhythm in the turning of the year. Let the soft lessons of heroes, to mend, to care, to lead gently, settle into your bones. Now, as your breath slows and the room grows familiar in the dark, take one last, gentle image. A table in a humble home, a single lamp in the center, a family passing a simple bread and a small bowl, each hand offering what it can. The lamp is not brilliant. It does not make grand light, but it is enough. It is the kind of light that lets people sleep with peace. Rest in that light. Let the stories move through you like a tide, gentle and sure. Tomorrow will ask of you again, but tonight the myths keep watch. They have traveled long and far to sit beside your earliest breath and your last exhale. Sleep well, traveler of old tales. The ancient world hums softly, and its whisper is yours to carry.